I'm going to talk about educational prosperity in Canadian schools. It's a model that I developed when I was doing work with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and with UNESCO. And I'm going to talk about what we've learned so far in trying to bring this model to life in our work. I want you to start by thinking about, did you have an indelible, memorable experience when you decided you were going to become an educator, a teacher? I've asked a few people, and some people say, yeah, I know right away, and then some others, it's a little longer process. But just have a think about that as I talk about some of my experiences. So I want to talk about our journey, our passion. The hour can be the great leaders in this room. The hour can be people at the Learning Bar, and it's also me. But I'm going to tell you about my experience. So, growing up in Treaty 4, this is a wee boy, we're going to call him Noah, who's walking home from his first day of kindergarten. And if things stay the same as where we are, his chances of graduating are only about 30%, which is just unconscionable when you think about the wealthy country we live in and what's possible for children. So Treaty 4 is on southern part of Saskatchewan, but it stretches into Manitoba as well, a little bit in Manitoba and a little bit in Alberta as well. You can see on the map there. And so I grew up in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. This is Moose Jaw in the 1950s, and it actually looks pretty much the same today, except the cars are different. And just on the right, there's the Walter Scott building, where I misspent a good part of my youth at Connaught Billiards, and it's closed now. But that was just kind of a safe haven in many ways for youth. But so I was there, and for a short period, I worked there as well. So when I was in grade 10, I had the opportunity to work at Camp Easter Seal. So Camp Easter Seal is a summer camp program for children and adults with intellectual and physical disabilities. And I ended up working there for 5 summers. Started as a counselor in training and a counselor and eventually the sports director of the camp. So I worked there right through my university days. It was one of those indelible experiences, such a huge positive experience. I loved working with the kids and just having fun. And I went back at the end of that summer, and I bought my aunt's car. It was a 1950 Dodge, which she sold me for $50. I actually had a photo, but I've taken that out of there. And I ended up being offered a job to work as a psychiatric nurse's aide in the large institution in Moose Jaw called the Saskatchewan Training School. Oh, and by the way, we have people from the Yorkton area, which is where it's just down the road from Camp Easter Seal, so I'm sure you know it. So I worked at this large institution in Moose Jaw that it's really hard to describe, but it would house about 1,500 people with intellectual disabilities. It was open in the spirit of inclusion. It was to bring people up to the point where they could get back into society, but it never really worked that way. There's comparable institutions here, right across Canada. There were similar institutions. The Woodlands in BC, the Michener Center in Alberta, the Saskatchewan Training School, and then the Selkirk Training School here. I'm not sure exactly the name. So anyway, that was such a huge contrast for me. So you go in the morning and you check in with your card in the main building there, and then you went out to one of the wards, either to the left or the right, and the wards were named after, they were called high grade or low grade. So as soon as you checked in, they say, are you high grade or low grade today? Horrible, just as a start, right? And the names of the high grade wards were named after indigenous tribes. There was Algonquin, Cree, and so on. And the low grade wards were named after animals, and in particular birds. There was lark and robin and so on. And so I came home from that, and I I was bawling, and my mom said, "No, you're not going back there." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'm going back there." And even now when I talk about it, I well up. And I've said it a few times when I broke out crying in front of a big audience like this. And it's because it's such an indelible experience, and it wasn't the work, or it wasn't seeing people warehoused, as it were. It was really an encountering adults with we call it ableism nowadays, but any kind of ism is all about thinking other people have a different self-worth, so it's their worthiness. And I think that was when first I decided I was going to quit school and become I was working as a psychiatric nurse's aide. I was going to quit school and become a psychiatric nurse. And indeed, in grade 11, I dropped out of school for a period and decided I was going to be a psychiatric nurse. But I didn't tell my mom I was in a single-parent family until finally she was looking for me because the school was calling, wondering if I had been absent for several days. So she phoned Connaught Billiards, and I opened the phone as I was working. Connaught Billiards. She said, Doug, is that you? So anyway, she had the good sense to say, no, you should not become a psychiatric nurse. There's some other things you can do, and you got to finish high school. So she booted me back into high school, and away we go. So several years later, I had the opportunity to visit a residential school. It's one of the schools that we were working with that was doing our early years evaluation, and I went there, and I was just horsing around with the kids, having a lot of fun on the thing. One of the questions on the EY is hopping on one foot and so on, or sorry, skipping and then hopping and so on. And the elders came over, and they enjoyed being with the children. And then we went outside, and they pointed through the little grove of trees. There's our old residential school. I was astounded that it was still standing, first of all. We didn't close our last residential school in Canada until 1996. And the Saskatchewan Training School that I showed earlier, it didn't get closed until 2016. Not that long ago, really. And so, again, that was an indelible moment for me. I drove back with one of our Indigenous partners. Her name's Lori Whiteman, and I said, Lori, I'm so ashamed that I grew up in Moose Jaw for those many years, and I didn't even know about colonialism and residential schools. We weren't taught anything about that. And in fact, and she said, she was very kind. She said, but don't you see that seclusion was by design? And it's still there. I mean, that same kind of them and us seclusion. And I have to say, I was thinking about this last night, getting ready for my talk. I said, oh, okay, I'm not going to cry. But one of the women yesterday from working at Frontier, one of the literacy mentors, she spoke very passionately about the trauma of many of not only the students, but also the staff of the last 2 years, and more generally the trauma of colonialization. And when there's something that's in me from high school days that all of a sudden can well up, and I wouldn't even call that a trauma, but I just can't imagine the successive and ongoing trauma that people feel, and there must be huge triggers that can trigger things at a moment's notice, not only among staff, but also amongst kids. So I use the term catalyst. One of our Indigenous partners in northern Saskatchewan, they call them, instead of the literacy mentors, they say literacy catalysts. So I was there last summer, and I made up my own definition of catalyst using the definitions from a few different dictionaries. And I say a catalyst is someone who causes great change to happen. And you are all catalysts, and I think when you think back of what your indelible moment was when you decided to go into education, there's something there that has brought you here today, and you have this tremendous dedication to the field. You wouldn't be here today, and you wouldn't be the school leaders that you are. This term educational prosperity, and I'll say more about the framework in a few minutes. It's a framework of evaluation that informs school policy and practice. And I'm going to be focusing on 3 critical transitions. So I use this term wicked problems. A wicked problem is one that's complex and multi-causal. So the so-called team problems, you probably, if you had some training, say, you have a model. What's the problem? What are the causes of the problem? What are the possible solutions? What's the best possible solution? Nice linear flow that you could follow. Wicked problems aren't like that. They're complex, multi-causal. I would never use the term root cause for anything like a wicked problem. And so I want to talk about three wicked problems. One is the reversing the trend in declining literacy rates. And I'll show you a graph in a moment and about literacy rates in Canada and BC, that they've been declining. And then I'm going to talk about a wicked problem is trying to increase the graduation rates of Indigenous students. And one of my colleagues said, well, maybe it's just talk about low SES students or students growing up in poverty. And that's okay, because many of the problems that Indigenous students experience are a result of poverty. But in addition to poverty, you've got the effects of structural racism. That's a big deal. And you've also got the effects of colonialism. And then we could add to that isolation for many communities and so on. So it's all of that, all of poverty and low socioeconomic status, and it's about this overlay of other things. And then number 4 is reducing the prevalence of students suffering anxiety and depression. So addressing wicked problems is not something you can do in a straightforward linear way. You have to have small groups of dedicated people who are dissatisfied with the status quo and believe that system changes are possible. So I'm going to have a little brief tour of educational prosperity. I worked a lot with the PISA study. You've probably heard PISA, Program of International Student Assessment. It's a study of students at reading, math, and science skills at age 15. And then with that, it's closely connected to UNESCO. So I was over to Paris a lot, working with some of the leaders from various countries. There's 80 countries involved now, at least, in PISA. And really got interested in how they bring data to bear on public policy and on school policies in their countries. So I set out this model and identified 6 stages of schooling, of development across the life course. So it's a life course approach. When you think of Noah, it starts not at birth, but it starts at conception and then carries on right through to graduation. And so we started looking at what we call prosperity outcomes. What are the outcomes that are valued by a community, by a school district, by a province? What are those outcomes, or a country? And then what are the foundations for success, the things that drive those outcomes? So here we have the model here. You can see those 6 stages of development across the top. And the prosperity outcomes, we came upon those by meeting with leaders from a lot of different countries to say what's really important in your country. And we condensed it down to this set of a finite set of outcomes. And who could agree with, at the prenatal stage, you need healthy pregnancy and healthy delivery? And who could disagree with language development, cognitive development, so on? You get very good consensus across communities and countries and so on, right up until the last stage there, where there's a little more variation. Some countries are more interested in ethics, kids becoming ethical citizens. Some make a lot of effort to develop leadership skills and so on. And you'll see health and well-being is in there as well. So part of the model, I talk about 4 ways success develops. Some of it's biologically embedded right at birth. If you don't have a healthy pregnancy, healthy delivery, you can get things that are embedded that are basically irreversible, very, very hard to change. And so a child's potential, instead of being a range up here, is a range down there. There's still a range, though, and when you hit the school system, your job is to make sure they come at the higher end of the range, whatever range of potential that child has. there's biological embedding, there's the effect of the foundations of success, and then there's selection effects. At each stage of development, there's ways that kids get selected into one type of school or another, the best preschool or this school or that school, and so on. And then finally the cumulative effects. And what I'm going to talk about today mostly has to do with cumulative effects. And I'm going to focus on reading. That's kind of the centerpiece of all this, and certainly that's the core. I'd say one of the core goals of Frontier School Division is really making sure children learn to read well during that early primary stage from age 6 to 9. And those reading skills are very related to the early development skills as kids enter into kindergarten. And then when they learn to read well, it's related to their educational attainment, how long they're going to stay at school, their academic achievement, their health and well-being, and engagement. When I was talking to Marlene earlier about her indelible experience, she said that in the Department of Justice, you had kids who were kickouts. And I said, well, usually we say pushouts, but kickouts as early as grade 2, to be kids leaving school in grade 2. And certainly, in the working with PISA, that's what we saw in a lot of low-income countries. And getting those things in place, educational achievement, educational attainment, then that's related to well-being. So it's very closely connected right from conception through those first few years of life right on into high school. So this is important because if you're got a provincial assessment that says, oh, let's look at the results at grade 3, or let's look at the results at grade 6. Let's just say grade 6. The skills of kids at grade 6 are not all about those grade 4 or 5 teachers. It's the cumulative effect of everything that happens from way back there. And so the kids are coming along. I don't know if I can use the pointer here, but I'm not going to try. I might zap. Let's see. Yeah, maybe you'll see. So it's the cumulative effect of healthy pregnancy, healthy delivery, and then that begets certain kinds of foundations. And indeed, from there, you might get selected into a good preschool. So the path of that wee boy Noah is affected by a whole chain of events that happens right from birth. And I want to also say something about this term, resilience. When I presented this work to Minister of Education in Guatemala, she said, but don't you believe in resilience? I mean, the kids have a bad start. And I said, yes, but resilience isn't a characteristic of individual children. Resilience is access to all those good things in life right along the chain of events. So if you hear some politicians say, oh, but for the, I grew up in a poor family and look at me now. That politician undoubtedly had supports all the way along. So that's what we mean by resilience. And before I go further, I want to just talk about equality, equity, and school effects. Avem, thank you so much again for coming. Okay, thank you. Thanks. But no-take, still a good thing. It puts it from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. So, so let me talk about equity, equality, and school effects. I was asked, a colleague of mine, Dr. Lucia Tremonti, who's affiliated with the Learning Bar and a professor of sociology at the University of New Brunswick, she and I were asked to do this report for Brazil on equality and equity. And I went to the literature, and those terms kind of got used interchangeably. So I set up this model that was eventually adopted by the OECD and then UNESCO to say equality is about the difference between one group and another group. What's the difference in math scores between boys and girls? What's the difference in language scores between kids who are new Canadians versus those who are not new Canadians? Indigenous youth, not Indigenous youth. So we got to define the outcome clearly, and then we also have to define the subpopulation clearly, and even those things there's a bit of, even like something like disability, where do you draw the line, for certain kinds of disabilities, and things like ADHD and so on are not so clearly defined. Autism, we now know that there's so much more variation on the spectrum than we ever thought there was 20 years ago. So you've got to define those well and then say, what are the differences? And it's not only in the differences in mean scores, but the differences in the distribution. And I'll show you why that's important in a minute. Equity is about whether those subpopulations have the same access to all the things that matter, the foundations for success, that long row of things that I said. Here are the things that drive those outcomes. And so the big ones that we use are inclusive environments, quality instruction, learning time, material resources, and family and community support. So do children from low socioeconomic status families and more well-to-do families, do they have the same access to those things as other families? And never mind my misspent youth, as found in the pool hall, Moose Jaw. Another part of my misspent youth was probably 20 years studying school effects. We're doing huge multi-level regression models and so on, because I was very interested in trying to figure out what is it that makes for an effective school. I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek about that, because it enabled me to work with organizations like the World Bank and OECD. But our focus is, what are the differences in outcomes between low and high status groups? And then do they have the same access to those foundations? Because that's really what's key. So, getting started. Here's my first of 3 pieces. And here we have our wee boy, Noah, going into kindergarten. And we really want to know his skills on those 5 pieces: awareness of self, environment, social skills, approaches to learning, language development, cognitive development, physical development. And that, by the way, is a very ubiquitous model that's set out by UNESCO and so on. It just isn't something invented by the Learning Bar, and it underlies most assessments of kids as they're going into kindergarten. And then the core thing is reading. Are they going to get the skills? Noah going to get the skills that he needs, and for a girl, he or she needs as going into kindergarten. So in talks maybe 10 years ago, I was saying we're stalled. That was my title for this slide. We're stalled. We're not moving forward. After 20 years, and in my educational report that I did for UNESCO, and you can get a copy of it, just ask us, there's flatline. Most countries over the past 20, 25 years have not improved their literacy skills. They've just stayed steady. All the investments we make, reading scores have stayed steady, math scores have stayed steady. But now I'm saying they're declining. And there you can see that the Canadian scores are declining fairly substantially, from a score of around 530 something down to around 520. And then if you look at Manitoba's scores, back in 2000, the average score is 530, very close to the Canadian mean, but it fell very dramatically, especially between 2006 and 2009. And so that's quite concerning. It looks like it's stabilized now, but at a level below the OECD average. So when the 500 averages for the 32 wealthy countries of the world that are members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So it's stabilized, I think. We'll see, because we don't know yet the effects of COVID, what COVID's going to bring to this story. So I'm going to show you in a minute that when scores decline, kind of your mental model may be, well, the mean scores decline, that the distribution just shifted over like this, and then it declines some more and it shifts over like that. It doesn't work like that. It is that the distribution gets more and more skewed. So you have more and more kids who are vulnerable. And so in Canada, the number of children, we're at the bottom 2 levels of PISA, that's levels 1 and 2, that a maximum grade level of grade 5, but I've written grade 3, 4 for level 2, it's about right. That went up from 27.6% to over 33%. And I'll show you in the next slide, the punchline is that a third of our children are vulnerable. A third of our children don't have the reading skills necessary to go on into post-secondary education when they hit the end of grade 10, grade 11. And in Manitoba, that level of vulnerability went from 29% to 44%. Not at 50%, but I don't know. We'll see what's happened after COVID, but it's substantial. So the punchline here is only 2 out of 3 students in Canada learn to read accurately with fluency and understanding by age 15. Okay, so what about kindergarten assessments? I look at kindergarten as kind of the safe haven to ease the transition into school. You want those skills there that are pre-primary skills. And we look at upstream interventions, what's happening before kids get to kindergarten. So the assessment is a post-test for everything that happened before. And it's also a pre-test of the downstream interventions, what's going to happen next. A wise senior official in Ottawa once, when I came out with this book called Vulnerable Children, Thelma actually dug it out of her bag yesterday. I hadn't seen a copy for a long time. He said, because we came out, we said 28% of Canadian children are vulnerable. And he said, well, governments have very blunt instruments. And I think the superintendents here, like Reg and Christian, will say, yes, our instruments are blunt. You've only got 3 things: money, information, and legislation. So you can pour money at a problem. You can provide information out to schools. This is the best way to teach reading, and this is and you can bring about legislation. Everyone in the school district now is going to do this. Or with governments looking upstream before kids enter kindergarten, all children have to get a vaccination, or all children have. So there's money, information, and legislation. And then we're saying downstream. What are the interventions, whether it's a reading intervention or whatever? So whenever I look at policies, I think I put them in that category first of all. Is it money, information, and legislation? Quite often it's a mix of the 3. So when we have kids coming into kindergarten, we want assessments to inform system change. That's the piece about a wicked problem. How are we going to bring about structural changes in the system? So we can look at long-term trends of indicators of inequality and equity, and we can identify students that need extra support. But an early years assessment can also support teachers, helping them guide planning, identify some high-yield teaching strategies that can bring attached resources to it, so certain learning activities and so on. And it also can identify students that require extra support. And even within the kindergarten year, we can assess growth from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. I love this picture here because I can't, the boy looks like this kind of a devious smile on his face, and the girl seems to be pointing out something to him, and I'm not sure who's the provocateur here, but it's just such a cute photo. And it's saying we can reliably measure the growth in student skills that are most predictive of school success. Before I go on, this is another little lesson like my equity quality lesson. If we look at most schools, the skills are negatively skewed. In other words, that tail goes out to the left. So as things become more and more vulnerable, then it starts to shift. As you get more low socioeconomic status schools, it shifts. And so in very low socioeconomic communities with a lot of poor families, the distribution shifted the other way. And so now if I add on this notion of RTI scores, in most schools, we usually use a 70-20-10, 70% tier 1, 20% tier 2, 10% tier 3, and most assessments will draw their cut points such that you got the 70-20-10. But look at kids, I missed the crucial part here. I'm not really good at using pointers, but I'll do my best here. When kids this isn't the age of the child, this is the child's skill level. So at age 5, most kids coming into kindergarten are between, say, 4 years, 8 months, 5 years, 7 months, and they have skills of a 5-year-old. But you have some kids even with skills of a 6-year-old. But some kids are here with skills of a 4-year-old or even a 3-year-old down here. And that's actually what it's like on the ground. There's a 4-year age range in skills. And that's so important to understand. Why? Because that's what the kindergarten teacher has to deal with. And the kids going into grade 1, still a 4-year age range. So when we talk about diversity, this is the inclusion. That's the central challenge for teachers all over the world. How am I going to cope with this 4-year age range? And we've had so many strategies over the years, putting them into different schools, different classes within schools, different groups within the classes, and so on and so forth. And then we got the term differentiation now. That is the challenge of teachers. And then when you get to that low socioeconomic status community, you've still got a 4-year age range, but now you've got a lot more kids at Tier 1, at Tier 2 and Tier 3. And indeed, in some of the communities where we've worked, I'm thinking of a few communities in Saskatchewan, where we measured the kids' skills as they're going into kindergarten with a whole big battery of tests. And on average, the kids were 1 full year behind in their skills. So they're entering in their age 5, but their average was grade 4. So they're a full year behind before they even enter kindergarten. Doesn't kind of make sense, but that's the way we think about it. Reading at grade level, well, what does that mean anyway? Because there's a 4-year age range. Okay, so, and there's a good example with this is Calgary. I don't have a Manitoba example, but we've been doing mapping in Manitoba as well. But you look at those schools down in the south, and you see that 70-20-30 split. Sorry, 70-20-10 split, as you went. But look at those schools in the northeast, where you've got some schools with over 50% of the kids who are vulnerable. Over 50%. I always think of 2 teachers sharing an apartment, 2 kindergarten teachers, and one goes up to the northeast and the other goes down to the south. They've got a different job description, folks. One comes home with a sore neck and tired and just wants to listen to music for an hour to chill out. And the other, I just had a great day. The kids were wonderful. But it really is like that on the ground. It really is. So what we learned so far, I call it the 50-20 rule. In most school districts, about half of the students who are vulnerable with Tier 2 and Tier 3 learning needs are in 20% of the schools. So if you've got a school district with 50 schools, you're probably going to have 10 schools with very high levels of vulnerability. Okay? And the link between background knowledge, these same guys that brought you the simple view of reading, researchers from New Zealand mainly, we know the link between background knowledge, cognitive ability, and language skills at age 5 are strongly related to whether they're going to become successful readers. And in fact, we've now identified 10 particular skills based on the literature and our own data. These 10 skills, we can do the RTI classification with those 10 skills very accurately. In fact, most teachers can tell you these are the kids that are going to be vulnerable and are not going to learn to read well. But you add on that piece of data, and it's very confirming. And attention and regulation, self-regulation are also key. When you do the big kind of regression models that I was used to doing, though it doesn't change we call it the amount of variance explained. It doesn't change very much, but that's because there's a relatively small number of them. But to those kids themselves, that's very important, and they're vulnerable. Walking down the hall with a guy named Neil Dubosky. Is Neil going to be on today? Oh, no. Okay, well, we can share a video with you. Neil Dubosky, he's one of our partners that we've worked with, and he was one of the first schools that was using Confident Learners. So we're walking down. I've been in his classroom, which is wonderful. He has this huge aquarium where he's trying to bring land-based education inside the school, where they had a fish spawning thing in the classroom, if you can imagine. And walking down the hall with him after, towards where his wife was teaching in special ed, and he said, how many kids of our indigenous communities have special ed needs compared with non-Indigenous communities? I said, I don't know, but I think it's about 2 to 1 at least. And so then he went on, he was been working with a big group in Ottawa, so was commissioned to write a paper on this, and the answer we came up with is about 2.4 to 3 times as many Indigenous students are vulnerable as they're going into school compared with non-Indigenous students. And then finally, reading skills at age 15. We know that they're a strong predictor of what's happening next whether a student graduates from school. In the classroom, there's a nice little book. It's called Stop, Think, Act by this McClelland and Tomney. And it's about ways to teach self-regulation skills to kindergarten kids or grade 1 kids. It's very nice. And we've used some of those types of activities in our work. Okay, now this may be a little controversial for some of you, but active teaching approaches that involve direct, strong guidance are more effective than developing core skills than minimal guidance approaches such as discovery learning and inquiry learning and so on. Alberta went down the road of inquiry-based teaching in a big way for 10 or 12-year period, and their results are declining as well. And this isn't to say that we don't want to give kids lots of opportunities to do inquiry-based things, but you're not going to get there without some direct instruction. Kids aren't going to learn their alphabet just by playing in PlayStations. So the keynote here for me is intentional play-based learning. There's an intent of what has to happen next. So the shift in thinking at each one of these stages, I've got 2 more to go, and I'm already out of time. Oh my, okay. I got to go a little bit faster here. Thelma, we're going to cut you back. That literacy is rife, the literature is rife with these false dichotomies, play-based versus work-based. Not until kids come along in the end of kindergarten, they jump into a work-based environment where all the kids are in rows. It doesn't work like that. Indeed, education can be play-based all the way through school, in my view. It can be engaging and fun. And kindergarten's a safe haven where children can strengthen their readiness skills, and we can monitor children's skills in the kindergarten year and report results on equality and equity. Okay, next one. I got the word from the boss here that I'm out of time, so I got to move it. Move it. The transition from early primary to late primary. So here we have NOAA, and we want to thinking about NOAA and increasing the graduation rates of Indigenous students, and that was what my second problem was. So, number 1, we need to change our approach to teaching reading during the primary years. And systematic phonics is markedly more effective than a 3-cueing approach or balanced literacy. And I know people here in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan have been heavily invested in the 3-cueing approach, and I've got to say, every day it seems another state has come out and mandated. We're getting rid of the 3-cueing. We've got to do science of reading and have systematic phonics. My view here is, and it's supported by the years of research in my misspent first 20 years of my career of looking at what makes for an effective school and effective classroom, is that the quality of classroom instruction is all important. Teachers can motor through one of these science of reading courses in a couple of weeks, but for things to change, has to be a change in daily practice in the classroom, full stop. So to me, it's more about the science of teaching and learning than it is about the science of reading. And the last point here is that reading interventions need to be long-term and intensive. Pulling out kids and sending them down to the special needs teacher for a little bit of magic dust, it doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. Pull-out programs don't work, and short-term interventions don't work. Not only that, they're too expensive. So think about Reg and his school division. If he's got over a third of the kids who are vulnerable, maybe 60-70% of the kids are vulnerable, what are you going to do in this school where 70% of the kids are vulnerable? Are you going to pull all of them out all day long, put them back in. It's way too expensive, and it doesn't work. So this paper here by these 3 women, Castle's Rational Nation, you can download that or we can send it to you. This is the model that we base a lot of our work. We have these 3 phases: becoming a reader, becoming a skilled reader, becoming an expert reader. And I'll just tell you what happens at each of those. We very carefully design the scope and sequence of when things happen. And that's what the science of teaching doesn't give you. Those here's phonemic awareness and phonics and all that. That doesn't give it to you. It doesn't show you what's the order of skills to be taught and how do we constrain things at each step of the way. So in that first phase, it's all about decoding. Kids have to learn how to decode words before they can move forward. And so, to me, the whole emphasis of if you had 2 reading blocks in grade 1, both be on phonics. Don't parse it up with reading and writing and or whatever. Phonics. That's absolutely key. You say, well, don't they need to develop language? Yeah, they do. But kids come to school with over 2,000 words, 2,000 to 5,000 words, and it's very hard for you as a teacher to beat the clock, as it were, beat that rate at which they learn new words. So I like to see, you're going to teach some language here anyway. You're going to have stories and guided reading and all that. So they're going to build their vocabulary more, but they've got to learn to decode words. And then once they've done that, then they're on to phase 2, and that's about orthographic learning, which is really about learning the established conventions of the language. They'll get some punctuation there. And they'll also, in phase 1, we've got 44 phonemes in the English language. And we start off with the first 21, which are the easy ones, where what they hear is represented by a single letter in print. And then we got some digraph ones, more complicated ones. And we cover all 44. Once they know those 44 sound-to-letter correspondences, or what we call phoneme-grapheme relationships, then they already have access to 50% of the words. They can decode 50% of the words in the English language. They don't know the meaning of them all, but anyway, they can decode them. Now, if we could just add out of those phoneme graphemes, those graphemes, there's about 220 in the English language. If they can just learn another 60 more, then they're going to have access to 90% of the words and be able to decode words. So that's what we focus on, is the 61s, and at the same time we're looking at affixes, suffixes, and prefixes, and also a little bit on root words. Right? And then in phase 3, which would really start, and now I shouldn't use the term grade 3, because remember, there's a 4-year age range, right? When they have mastered the skills of phase 2, then they really just need to read widely and read a lot. And that's the goal of phase 3, is getting them to read all kinds of different books and so on. When kids are reading those, when they encounter a new word, they have the skills to sound it out for the most part, and then link it to some meaning in their long-term memory. And I said the science of reading is really about science of teaching. When we go into a community, we really want, well, first of all, it's systematic phonics instruction, but we really want them to learn how to do a structured lesson. It's something that I saw an article that said the one thing that John Hattie and Marzano agree on is the importance of structured lessons. And so that's what we do. We get everybody knowing how to do a structured lesson. All our lesson plans are set up as a structured lesson and so on. And then the next thing is moving them into cooperative learning. So not a daily 5 approach where the teacher is working with a small group and the other kids are in these playstations, or workstations, I should call it. I'm being a bit facetious. But getting them to know how to do a cooperative learning group, knowing how to create a cooperative learning group that's not high ability, low ability, and so on. They're very strategically designed. I'm just going to skip over this, but all to say that you need long-term interventions. You can't win the day with short-term pull-out programs, and you'll see the difference there. So what's going to take? We have a vision for change, and I'm going to skip over this because I think Reg will do a better job of this. what it takes to address this wicked problem. So I'll skip over that. My view on all of this, and I don't have any data substantiated, is that if you're thinking about, if you got a school where 50% of the kids are vulnerable, you're not going to win it by pull-out programs. And I firmly believe that all teachers can acquire the skills of a special needs teacher. I've looked at a lot of different curricula for masters in special ed, and there's nothing really magic there. The ground is shifted there towards, we don't teach by categories of disability anymore. Special ed programs are about creating inclusive environments, learning things about the science of teaching, and so on. And I've already mentioned that thing about grouping and so on. So the shift in thinking here is principals can play a lead role in school transformation. You are the catalyst, folks. Full stop. We're counting on you to be the catalyst. You're the lead learners by participating in professional learning alongside your school staff. You're cultivating relationships with school staff to support professional learning and shared accountability for student success. And you're the catalysts that are going to build those small networks within your community to really think hard about these wicked problems. Okay, last one. I know I'm out of town, but they don't need that long for lunch, do they? So I'm worse today. Usually I can get it down to an hour, but I think I'm over even an hour now. But The Best Within Us. This is a little book I carried around with me around the world like twice probably. And this is about that transition from late primary to secondary. Here's our boy Noah, and the wicked problem is how are we going to reduce the prevalence of students suffering anxiety and depression. And even before COVID, this was going up and up and up, the percentage of kids. And now with COVID, we don't even know where we're going to land. So when we talk about school student well-being, it's about the evaluations that students make about the quality of their lives, and it involves being physically and mentally healthy, feeling safe at school, having pleasurable experiences, which we call hedonia, and being accepted by others, call that sense of belonging, being engaged in experiences that are personally meaningful, called eudaimonia, and having a sense of purpose in life. So when we designed our framework for well-being, distinguished between eudaimonia and hedonia. And if you hadn't heard that term eudaimonia, don't feel badly, because I didn't probably 5 years ago. And now I'm all about it. It's about thriving. It's about getting to know your daemon, your true self. It comes from the Greek word. Or being the best you can be. So we've surveyed thousands of kids now, and this will sound so simple that I say, well, that's just common sense. It's all my mother ever wanted me to have was common sense. So I wish you were around now. But all kids want hedonia. They all want to have friends. They want relaxing moments. They love to go to the park or the beach. So all kids have that, but only about half of the kids we survey have what we call eudaimonia, are really on that path of understanding what their own personal goals in life are. So, and then sense of belonging, if I had just one measure of well-being, it would be sense of belonging. And this was a measure that we developed for the OECD PISA way back in the year 1998 as we entered in the first PISA, and it's really stood the test of time because it's so important. It's related to kids' feelings at school, it's related to their well-being, it's related to their academic achievement, and so on. And then lastly, anxiety. And I think you all can recognize anxiety either in yourself or in your kids, and it's feelings of fear, worrying more than other students, and being overly concerned about what other kids or the teacher are thinking about them. I'm going to kind of skip over this, but you'll get the slides. But the idea here was to think about these problems both in terms of the cohort. So we Noah, if he was starting kindergarten right now, born in, follow that orangey line back, born in 2016, and he's the graduate of 2034. So we like to refer to the kids, well, you're in the class of 2034. And by the way, that's going to be my retirement date. I've already told the staff, 2034. So I'm going to be around for a while. And don't laugh too hard now. But I'm, anyway, that was Christine laughing, so she knows it's true. So anyway, those are cohort effects. And when we look at these things that are related, kids are way more engaged in screen time than they were in the cohort 20 years ago. More cyberbullying. They're sleeping an hour less than they were 20 years ago. I mean, that's quite striking because not too many things like biological things like that change that fast. Participation in risky behaviors, alcohol use, drug use, early sexuality, gambling, and so on. And then graduates today are worried about the environment, poor jobs prospects, and so on. And then you have aging effects. Those are the two lines going up. Some things change as kids get older, despite any changes in the cohort. So our best example, this is data from Australia, is anxiety, levels of kids who are not experiencing anxiety. No, so this one's on sense of belonging, but it declines, and we call it the grade 9 dip. And you can see the grade 9 dip is bigger for girls than it is for boys. And so that's a aging effect. It cuts every cohort that comes along. We see the same kinds of things. And then finally is period effects. So those are things that happen at a certain period, like COVID. And using this model to think about these things is those period effects. Our wee boy Noah, if he's in grade 4 now, he's going to have a different experience of COVID than kids in grade 8 or grade 12, right? So, and that's what we don't know. You know, we're getting there. So I'll just finish with the U.S. now has proclaimed a national emergency in mental health. And they're attributing it, most of the things they're attributing it to are those cohort effects, things that have changed over the last 20 years. But they're also talk about COVID, and they also talk about the ongoing struggle for racial justice. So the prevalence of Indigenous youth who self-report mental health issues is 1.5 times that of non-Indigenous youth. And when you look at our students who self-identify as LGBTQ+, their prevalence is also much higher, prevalence of anxiety and depression and suicide, sadly, than those who are not LGBTQ+. Shift in thinking. So it's the same thing as the literacy skills. If you got 40% of your kids who are suffering mental health, you can no longer rely on a medical model. Even 10 years ago, only 8% of kids with mental health issues had access to a mental health professional. Ain't going to work, folks. And if you got 40% or 30%, you got to change the model. And we talk about a social model, and this comes also from, I'm talking about special ed, special kids with special needs. You got to change the model and think about how are you going to develop environments that are inclusive. What are you going to do to get kids having more positive experiences, changing their story, as Thelma would say? How are you going to get them to change their story? You're still going to have kids that you need to refer, for sure, to professionals, but you can bring everybody up. So, can we reverse the trends? Can we reverse the trends in declining literacy rates? Wicked problem number 1. Can we increase the graduation rates of Indigenous students? And can we reduce the prevalence of students suffering anxiety and depression? And I've been called a pathological optimist, and I believe we can through, there's Noah again, through strong leadership, through dedicated teachers, through family and community support, and through a relentless focus on building the foundations for success. Thank you very much. Sorry I went way over, but...